We have one more book of the same. Ticket holder 126. 126. We will hold it for you up in front. And the next book, Men on Strike, by Helen Smith. Ticket holder number 51. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce to you Erin Pizzey. She's a family care activist and novelist, founded the first women's shelter in the world in 1971 in the UK, subjected to death threats and boycotts after noting that most domestic violence was reciprocal and that women were equally capable of violence as men. Her father was a diplomat, and the family was captured by the invading Japanese army in Shanghai in 1942, and eventually traded for Japanese POWs. Successfully sued Macmillan Publishers, who claimed she had ties to militant groups that staged bomb attacks in the 1970s, while militant feminist groups threatened her and her children with death and shot her dog. When her grandson with schizophrenia committed suicide in a prison cell, she successfully overturned a coroner's verdict, charged the guards with neglect, and won. The case was the first ever finding of neglect contributing to suicide.
Okay.
Please put your hands together for Erin Pizzey.
Right, I've got half an hour. Now, in the beginning, I was booted out of the women's movement, and I've still got the letter banning me, the liberation movement, from all the collectives. Because I stood up and said, if this is your intention in these huge collectives to say that the family is a dangerous place for women and children, I, for one, do not believe you. Anyway, you had nothing to do with women. There has never been a women's movement. It was not a women's movement. It wasn't about women. It was about a handful of powerful Marxist women turning on men of the left and brilliantly deciding that they would create a billion-dollar industry. Now, at the time that they were doing this, they weren't involved at all. Okay, I'll shout. So what happened was that for those first 4 years, as the women poured through the doors with their children, I realized, and partly because I'd come from a very violent, dysfunctional family, and it was my mother who was particularly cruel and violent towards me, and I carried this with me on behalf of my own brother and twin sister, that we never had a childhood. We were robbed by both our parents. But the one thing I was very aware of is that it's a tragedy when the father is violent, but when it's a mother, it's a catastrophe. Because she carries this baby, and as the women poured into the refuge, they'd say, my baby's not moving, my baby's not moving. And I'd say to them, look, if you smoke a cigarette, you share it with the baby. If you drink a drink, you share it with the baby. The chemicals of rage and anxiety you share with the baby. What do you expect the baby to do except to stay there and be born already wired up, damaged? Now MRI proves what I was saying 40 years ago. The first 100 women that came in, 62 of them were as violent as the men they left. And what I had, trying to say this and stand up at a time when the militant radical movement was running out of money. They could no longer actually attract women because they were too radical. And women did not want to hear that marriage was an unsafe place for them. They didn't want to hear that sleeping with men was sleeping with the enemy, and all the rubbish that went with that. And so what actually happened was that as far as women coming in, we began to organize among ourselves because there was nobody else. And most of the women who came in, who were violence prone, said, there is a problem for me, I cannot make relationships, and that's absolutely true. So as the militant women were coming in, and for them it was a bonus because they were looking for funding and a just cause. What better than innocent women of men's violence, all men the patriarchy? What a brilliant funding strategy. You had half the population oppressed by the other half, and you took the money off the other half to pay for it. And this has now created what is a very, very dangerous, I call it the evil empire. It has done more damage to relationships between men and women, and I have kept saying, if we do not stop the progress of this infiltrating all parts of everybody's lives, including the ideologies become like a virus, that to be anti-feminist is somehow to be a misogynist who hates women. It's not anything to do with that. It is actually understanding the political movement that has come out of what was originally a therapeutic community that would give every person, men and women and children, a second chance to listen and to understand other strategies for survival. Nobody could do it for my parents because there was nothing at that time. I knew that it needed to be done, and as the women moved in and expressed their violent behavior and were violent to their children, the volunteers and the other mothers were there, and we all worked on the whole concept of what is and how can you mother and father your children if no one has ever taught you. And that's exactly what I grew, a huge community. Because women were pouring in from all over the country, we squatted huge buildings. I owned an enormous hotel in Richmond, Palm Court Hotel, had 47 private suites, and 78 mothers and kids moved in there. We had rows of buildings that had been left empty by boroughs. We just took them over at night and left the door. Notice on the door, the police would come and say, all right, it's you. So we were a huge community, men, women, children, all working together. And that was my vision. So you can imagine what I felt when I actually, in 1974, we were sitting there and having a small conference to talk to other refugees about how they could set up and we could federate. And in March, highly organized women from across the country and voted themselves into the National Federation of Women's Aids, who now really own most of the refugee shelters in England, and Refuge, my old refuge, owned the others. In America, I came to America in the early 70s, and I could see what was happening. Exactly the same thing. Women were scribbling title, whatever it was, to get the money to create the empire, and on the backs of very fragile women and children. And this is going on 40 years, it's going on, and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I stood back then, and I was begging, I was saying to people, this is a fraudulent movement. Listen to what I'm saying. And nobody would say anything. Because for a long time, the media, the courts, the agencies, certainly the universities, were preaching this doctrine, which was in essence a feminist Marxist doctrine that obliterated men off the scene. But the same thing was going to happen. Women would be putting their children, one of the demands, 24-hour nurseries. Women would become the earners. Men would become dispensable. And it sounded so laughable 40 years ago. Nobody would believe me. Now I sit here, and I don't think there's anybody in this room who doesn't believe me. And many of you... And why this is historic up for a discussion about men and men's issues. My biggest problem, actually, and this is going to be a very troublesome thing to talk about, my main problem was getting women who come from years, generations of family violence, not only family violence, but family incest, and saying to women or with their 15-year-old sons sitting on their laps, wrapped together like pretzels, stop it. You can't do this. This is not appropriate behavior. Because for many women coming into the shelters and the refuges, they don't know what appropriate behavior is. How are you supposed to know if no one teaches you? How are you supposed to... I mean, I was an extremely violent child. I wrote my memoir. It's called Infernal Child. And why would I not be a violent child when your mother whips you with ironing cords? And you stand in front of a teacher in Canada, in Toronto, and you say, look at my legs, which had actually scalded from the blood. And she says, well, no wonder you're such a terrible child. Yeah, and this is going on even today. How many times do you read stories of children going to school, trying to get food out of rubbish bins with the teachers, good heavens, ignoring it all, because nobody wants to speak out. Yes, there is a huge amount of very normal, ordinary people who go about their daily business and are not at all involved in what we're talking about. But those of us who are in the belly of the beast, who've been born into it, who have had no other opportunities, these are the women I love and work with. I work and have always worked with violent women. And you see, this is, from the very beginning, me feeling, actually, it's not a men's issue. Yes, of course men are violent. Men can be as violent as each other. But if you don't mother the mother, if you don't teach the mother how to mother the children, and the father to father the children, what do you expect to happen? My argument was, if we can take and mother the mothers, and the fathers if they wanted to be included, we could empty mental hospitals and jails. But then you come up against something else. As President Governor said to me, she said, every child that's born into a dysfunctional family is a point on my pension. Yes? Now, I think we should frame that, because that tells you about the beast. And it's like bigger fleas on this body that needs the blood. And so what's happening now? Well, what's happening, I can tell you what's happening in England. If a woman is considered unfit mother, the child is taken away from her. She then replaces the child within 9 to a year. That child is taken and taken and taken, and this fills the adoption quotas, this fills the children's homes, this fills all the needs for all these huge empire that has grown around this very sad human fact that some children are born into terrible, terrible family situations. And when Peter, for instance, his mother was a prostitute, she was incestuous with him, his father sodomized him whenever he felt like it, the mother disappeared, so he was taken into care. At 13, he strangled a boy of 11 in the bushes, right? Everybody was baying for his blood. He was a 13-year-old boy. Who do you put in the dock? His mother, his father, the agencies. And when later on, he found a woman had 3 children by her and repeated the patterns and was molesting his children, social workers actually said he reformed. How could he reform? Nobody put out a hand to him. They jailed him and they punished him. I can tell you, you cannot punish already battered and abused children. There is nothing that the state can do to them, even take their lives, than is what's happened to them in their childhoods. And I want us to forget about blaming men or women, but actually begin to look at the judiciary, at the social services, at all the people who live off this human misery. I've got a new approach now to men. I say, how long have you been awake for? Because, as Anne said, and we work very closely together, as Anne said, it isn't just that you lose your family because you have a wife who has possibly a serious personality disorder, particularly if she's a narcissistic exhibitionist, and there is no known cure. That is the one thing that will attract men. She's the arm candy. She's the centre of all the attention in the middle of a room, and he wants her on his arm. And then it isn't till far too late, what I call the mask of sanity slips, and he's trapped. Now you can take away, right, you say it's her fault, she's taken away my children, she's told them that I molested the children. But when he turns to what he's always believed in, when he turns to the place that he pays his taxes, and he finds that it's corrupt. Family courts are corrupt from top to bottom in England. I don't speak for Canada, and I know you don't, but I promise you, they're secret. No decisions you ever come out of the courts. Terrible injustice are done in there. And to me, I fought in those courts for 40 years. They have to be disbanded. We have to, first of all, this whole business of battered, abused, and sexually abused people who grow up unable to make relationships. The courts can't deal with it. They're not set up to deal with it. The fact is, and I'm included in this, the only sanction the court has is to jail. It means nothing to me. So when they tried to jail me from the Magistrates' Court to the High Court to the House of Lords, back to Acton Magistrates' Court, to jail me, I would have been perfectly comfortable in Holloway. Anything was better than my childhood. So I want you to understand that we need not only to disband the family courts, but to also put this whole subject of battered and abused children and the kind of therapy and the kind of care that we need to give into the hands of the people who can really do it, who are trained to understand what's going on. For the majority of women in my refuge, the courts were part of their theatre. There's no question that anybody would tell the truth under oath. Having said that, of the 62, the other women were innocent victims of their partner's violence, and yes, their partners were extremely violent, in many cases dangerous, but they were integrated human beings who had been loved, mothered, and fathered, and once given a handout, they could move on and regain their lives. But the work I do is with women who have come from generations of violence. I've always seen, and it has always been, a generational family issue. The whole business, I've got, how many more minutes have I got? But the whole business of patriarchy and the gathering of billions and billions of dollars across the Western world, the whole business of persecuting men, of demonizing boys, of failing to educate, that has been a huge fraudulent movement. And we need... And first on my list is Hilary Clinton. Being one of the leaders of this fraudulent movement, followed by Germaine Greer, by Harriet Harman, by Benefit Ann's dead, but the whole lot of them. And we need to go after them. We cannot allow this to continue. And if we don't stop it, I don't see a future for marriage, for love, or for anything. And that question about marriage, I see men's point of view. Why on earth would you take a risk that has a 90% chance of stripping you of everything you have, particularly your children? I'm going to stop now because I know that you're all desperate for lunch. Thank you.